The real Lord of the Flies escaped from Cannibal Rock.
The wind did not merely blow, it possessed a physical weight, a crushing, palpable density that felt less like air and more like a solid wall of iron slamming against the world. Here, in the bottom latitudes of the globe, in the dreaded roaring 40s, the atmosphere was not a medium for life, but a hammer of the gods. It was January 1865, a time when the southern summer should have offered a reprieve, but the Auckland Islands knew no summer, only varying degrees of hostility. The schooner Grafton, a vessel of humble origins but stout heart, groaned in agony. She was a small thing, a speck of crafted timber, pitting its arrogance against the infinite fury of the subantarctic ocean. Inside the heaving cabin, Captain Thomasa Musgrave sat, bracing himself against the bulkhead, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the chart table. The lantern swung violently overhead, casting nauseating, pendulous shadows that danced across the sweating wood like frantic specters. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of shrieking rigging, the thunderous percussion of waves hammering the hull, and the terrifying high-pitched scream of the gale tearing through the spars. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of the bone. Musgrave, a man of seasoned resolve and quiet calculation, felt the cold pit of dread open in his stomach. He knew ships, he knew the language of wood and canvas, and the Grafton was screaming a death knell.
They were anchored inside Carnley Harbor, ostensibly a shelter, but the wind had shifted, turning their refuge into a trap. The anchors were dragging. He could feel it in the soles of his boots, a stuttering, grinding vibration that traveled up the keel. The holding ground was failing. "She won't hold, Captain." The voice of Francois Reynal, his first mate and a man of immense practical ingenuity, cut through the roar. Reynal's face was a mask of grim realization, illuminated by the flickering yellow light of the lantern. His eyes were wide, not with panic, but with the hyper-clarity of imminent disaster. "The chains are taut as piano wires. If one snaps—" Musgrave didn't need to finish the sentence. If a chain snapped, they would be hurled onto the rocky embrace of the lee shore within minutes. He stood up, the floor tilting wildly beneath him, throwing him against the bunk. "Get the man ready," Musgrave ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "If she goes fast. Tell them to grab what they can, but for God's sake, be ready to jump."
Barely had the words left his lips when a sound like a cannon shot detonated through the ship. The starboard anchor chain had parted. The Grafton lurched sickeningly, freed from her tether, and swung broadside to the mountainous swell. The motion changed instantly from a rhythmic pitching to a violent rolling wallow. "She's adrift," someone screamed from the deck. Musgrave scrambled up the companionway, the icy breath of the storm hitting him like a physical blow as he breached the hatch. The world outside was a maelstrom of obsidian and foam. The night was absolute, a void of blackness swallowed by the storm, save for the terrifying luminescence of the breaking waves. The sea was not water, it was a churning landscape of moving hills, white-capped and furious. Rain mixed with sleet slashed horizontally, stinging the skin like buckshot. Through the gloom, the roar of the surf against the rocks grew louder, a grinding bass note that vibrated through the hull. They were seconds away. "Brace yourselves," Musgrave bellowed, though the wind tore the words from his mouth.
The ship was lifted, higher and higher by a colossal swell, a mountain of black water that seemed to pause for a heartbeat at its apex. For a second, the Grafton hung suspended in the darkness, a helpless toy. Then gravity and the ocean conspired to bring her down. The descent was stomach-churning. The ship plummeted into the trough, and then came the impact. It was not a thud, but a shattering crunch that sounded as if the world's spine had snapped. The vessel slammed onto the jagged reef, the shockwave knocking every man off his feet. Timber screamed as the keel shattered. The hull buckled. Water, freezing and heavy, erupted over the bulwarks, sweeping the deck with the force of a rushing river. "Hold on! Hold on for your lives!" Reynal was shouting, clinging to the remnants of the shrouds. The ship was being murdered, beaten to death against the anvil of the Auckland Islands.
Another wave, larger than the first, picked up the broken carcass of the schooner and smashed it down again. The sound of rending wood was sickening, planks snapping like matchsticks, iron bolts shearing off with sharp pings. The water was waist-deep on the deck now, swirling with debris, loose spars, coils of rope, crates, and the personal effects of men who were about to die.
Musgrave tasted blood. He had bitten his tongue in the fall. He scrambled to his feet, water surging around his chest. The cold was instantaneous and paralyzing. It was not merely a temperature, it was a thief, stealing the heat and the will from the body in seconds. "To the boats! The dinghy!" cried Harris, one of the seamen, panic edging into his voice. "No!" Musgrave roared, grabbing the man by the collar of his oilskins. "The surf will smash it to splinters before you even launch. We have to get a line ashore. It's our only chance." The shore was a nightmare of jagged shadows, barely visible through the spray, but it was close, agonizingly close. The ship was rolling onto her beam ends, the deck becoming a steeply sloping wall. The masts, subjected to impossible torture, gave way. With a thunderous crack, the mainmast snapped 10 feet above the deck, crashing down into the boiling surf, taking a tangle of rigging with it. "Jump! She's breaking up!" The order was unnecessary. The ship was disintegrating beneath them. Musgrave looked at his crew, Reynal, Harris, McLaren, Forges. 5 men against the Antarctic fury. He saw the terror in their eyes, but also a desperate animalistic drive to survive. One by one, they threw themselves into the churning cauldron.
Musgrave was the last to leave. He took one final look at his command, the Grafton, now a twisted ruin, and vaulted over the rail. The shock of the water was like a sledgehammer to the chest. The air was punched from his lungs. He was tumbled, spun, and dragged down by the undertow. The water was a chaotic slurry of sand, foam, and broken timber. He flailed, his hands striking something hard and sharp, rock. Pain shot up his arm, but he clawed at it. The kelp, thick and slimy like the tentacles of a giant beast, wrapped around his legs, trying to drag him back into the deep. He kicked wildly, his boots heavy as lead. He surfaced, gasping for air, only to be buried again by a breaking wave. He was being tumbled in a washing machine of sharp stones and freezing brine. He didn't swim, he fought. He fought the water, he fought the kelp, he fought the overwhelming urge to just let go and let the cold take him. His hand found a crevice in a rock. He held on with a grip strength born of pure adrenaline, his fingernails tearing. The receding wave tried to suck him back, but he held. As the water rushed out, he scrambled forward on hands and knees, barking his shins, scraping the skin from his palms. He dragged himself up, out of the reach of the crushing surf, and collapsed onto the stones.
He lay there, heaving, vomiting seawater, his body shaking so violently his teeth rattled in his skull. He was alive, but as he looked up, wiping the stinging salt from his eyes, the reality of his salvation hit him. He was alive in hell. Around him in the gloom, other shapes were crawling from the surf, like primeval creatures emerging from the slime. Reynald was there, coughing water. Harris was curled in a ball, shivering uncontrollably. They were all there, 5 men, soaked, freezing, battered, and cast upon the most desolate shoreline on earth. The wind howled over them, indifferent to their survival. Musgrave looked back at the surf. The Grafton was gone, reduced to a field of debris grinding against the rocks. The moonless sky offered no comfort, only a suffocating darkness. He forced himself to sit up. The leadership burden, heavy and suffocating, settled back onto his shoulders. He could not afford to be just a survivor. He had to be the captain.
"Sound off," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the gale. "Who is hurt?" The answers came back in groans and stammers. Bruises, cuts, a twisted ankle, but no one was dead. Not yet. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold began its real work. The hypothermia was creeping in, a silent lethargy. Musgrave knew they had to move, find shelter, do something, where they would be corpses by morning. He looked at the jagged silhouette of the scrub rising behind the beach, a hostile, impenetrable wall of twisted rata trees. This was their new home, this wet, freezing, wind-blasted rock. The despair was a physical weight, heavier than the water in his clothes, but he pushed it down. He looked at Raynal, who met his gaze. In the Frenchman's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own grim resolve. They were the masters of this disaster now. "Gather close," Musgrave ordered, his voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Huddle together. We stay together. We survive this night." And as the 5 men clung to each other on that God-forsaken beach, the roaring 40s screamed their fury, angry that 5 small souls had dared to cheat the ocean of its due.
The cold was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating blanket of dampness that seemed to possess a malicious sentience. It pressed against the skin, seeped through the pores, and settled deep within the marrow of the bone, a relentless intruder that refused to be evicted. For the 5 men standing upon the jagged, unforgiving shoreline of the Auckland Islands, the cold was the first truth of their new existence. The gale that had shattered the schooner Grafton had abated only slightly, trading its screaming fury for a sullen, moaning persistence that drove the freezing rain sideways, stinging the face like handfuls of thrown gravel. Captain Thomasa Musgrave stood with his boots sinking into the sodden peat and sharp shingle, his eyes scanning the gray horizon where the sea met the sky in a seamless curtain of gloom. There was no sun, only a lighter shade of slate overhead, offering no warmth, no hope, and no sense of time. The wind carried the salt spray, mixing it with the sleet, coating every surface in a rime of ice and brine. It was a landscape devoid of color, painted only in shades of bruised charcoal, wet slate, and the dirty white of churning foam. The very air tasted of desolation. The wreck of the Grafton lay broken in the inlet, a skeletal testament to the violence of the night before. Her timbers, once the sturdy promise of profit and adventure, were now splintered, jagged teeth biting at the surf. Every wave that crashed against her carcass sent a shudder through the ground that Musgrave could feel through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic reminder of their utter destitution. "We are castaways," he thought, the word tasting of bile and salt. The reality of it had not yet fully calcified in his mind. It hovered on the periphery, a monstrous shadow waiting to engulf him. The ship groaned as the tide pulled at her, a sound like a dying beast refusing to let go of the earth. Barrels and crates bobbed in the violent wash, tantalizingly close yet dangerously out of reach, smashed against the rocks before they could be secured. The destruction was absolute. It was not just a loss of transport, it was the loss of their world, their connection to humanity, their shell against the void. Beside him, Raynal, the mate, was shivering violently, his teeth clattering with a sound like dry stones striking together. The Frenchman's face was a mask of blue-tinged pallor, his eyes wide and fixing on the wreckage with a disbelief that mirrored Musgrave's own. "She is gone, Captain," Raynal whispered, his voice cracking against the wind. "Truly gone." Musgrave turned, forcing his shoulders to square, forcing the trembling in his own hands to cease by clenching them into fists at his sides. He saw the terror in Raynal's eyes, a reflection of the abyss that yawned before them all. If the officers broke, the men would die. It was a simple equation. "Not gone, Mr. Raynal," Musgrave corrected, his voice rough but steady, a deliberate anchor for the others to hold on to. "She is broken, but she is still there. And whatever is inside her, whatever has washed up, that is our life now. We do not mourn her, we scavenge her." He spoke with a conviction he did not feel, but leadership in this hellscape was an act of theater as much as decision-making.
The other 3 crewmen, George, Harry, and Francois, huddled nearby, a pathetic tableau of misery. They were soaked to the skin, their meager clothing plastered to their bodies, offering as much protection against the subantarctic elements as paper would against a fire. They looked to Musgrave not with hope, but with the desperate, animalistic plea of creatures who have realized the cage door has locked behind them. Francois, the cook, sat with his head between his knees, rocking gently, muttering prayers that were snatched away by the wind before they could reach any god. Harry stared blankly at the surf, his hands tucked into his armpits, his face slack with shock. George, usually the strongest, looked diminished, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of the rain. "First principles," Musgrave muttered to himself, a mantra to stave off the panic. "Shelter, fire, water,
food. He turned to the men, pitching his voice to cut through the drone of the wind. "Move," he barked, startling Francois, who had begun to sink into a lethargic stupor. "Standing here is dying. If we stop moving, the cold takes us. We need cover before the night returns." The sheer wilderness that faced them was a chaotic tangle of twisted rata-trees and dense scrub, a vegetation that seemed to have grown in agony, bent and gnarled by the eternal winds. The ground was a treacherous sponge of bog and moss, concealing sharp rocks and deep holes filled with freezing brown water. They moved inland, fighting a landscape for every yard. It was not a walk, it was a battle. The brush clawed at their clothes and whipped their faces, leaving stinging red welts. Every step was a labor, sinking ankle-deep into the mire, pulling free with a sucking sound, only to sink again. They found a spot, slightly elevated and shielded by a massive overarching rock formation that jutted out from the base of a cliff like a stone brow. It was damp, dark, and smelled of rot and ancient earth, but it broke the wind. Here they would make their stand. It was a meager fortress against the elemental siege, but it was all they had. The construction of the tent was a frantic, clumsy affair. Fingers numb and devoid of dexterity fumbled with wet ropes and heavy, sodden canvas salvaged from the wreck. They lashed the fabric to the twisted trunks of the rata-trees, creating a low, sloping roof that flapped and snapped angrily in the gusts. It was not a house, it was barely a shelter. But as they crawled underneath, out of the direct lash of the rain, a collective sigh, half groan, half sob, escaped them. They were out of the wind, but the dampness was inescapable. The ground beneath them was wet peat. They laid down branches, attempting to create a floor, but the water seeped through everything. Inside the gloom of the tent, the darkness seemed to solidify, a heavy presence that pressed against their eyes. Musgrave sat near the entrance, his back against the cold stone, watching his men. They were unrecognizable, stripped of the bravadoed sailors, reduced to shivering bundles of misery.
"We need fire," Harry said, his voice small and trembling. "Captain, I can't feel my feet." Musgrave nodded. He knew that without heat, the night would kill them. Hypothermia was a silent assassin, already whispering to them in the numbness of their extremities. He reached into his waterproof oilskin pocket, his most prized possession now, and withdrew the small tin of matches. He held it up, rattling it gently. The sound was distinct, a dry percussion that sounded like wealth, like gold coins clinking together. "We have fire," Musgrave said, his voice imbued with a calm he had to manufacture. "But we must be careful. Wood is wet. Everything is wet." He looked at the tin, knowing that inside lay their only barrier against the freezing death. Each match was a day of life, a precious, finite resource that could not be squandered. The effort to start that first fire was a drama of agonizing proportions. They gathered deadwood from the underbrush, but it was saturated, soaking wet from the incessant rain. They shaved thin curls of wood with a knife that slipped in numb fingers, Reynal cursing softly in French as the blade grazed his thumb. Musgrave struck the first match. It flared, a tiny, defiant yellow star in the blue gloom, illuminating the desperate faces leaning in. Then a draft caught it. It sputtered and died. The collective intake of breath from the men was a sound of pure terror, a gasp of despair. "Easy," Musgrave murmured, though his own heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Block the wind. Reynal, use your coat. George, get closer." They built a wall of bodies around the small pile of shavings, shielding the potential spark with their very lives. The second match struck. The flame caught the dry inner shavings of a rata branch. It wavered, fought for life, turning the damp wood into smoke before finally a tongue of orange licked upward. They fed it like a newborn god, offering it tiny splinters, then twigs, then thicker branches. The smoke was acrid and thick, filling their small shelter, stinging their eyes and catching in their throats, but no one complained. The coughs were muffled, irrelevant compared to the miracle of thermal energy. The heat was meager, barely radiating a foot from the flames, but the psychological impact was immense. The fire pushed back the dark. It pushed back the beast of the cold. In the flickering light, their faces were illuminated, hollow cheeks, eyes rimmed with red, water dripping from their beards. They looked like a painting by an old master depicting the damned. Yet, in their eyes, the spark of survival had been lit alongside the wood. They huddled so close to the flames that the steam began to rise from their drying clothes, creating a mist that mingled with the smoke.
"What do we have?" Musgrave asked, breaking the silence that had settled over them. It was time for the inventory. It was a grim tally, laid out on a dry piece of canvas. A few pounds of biscuit, sodden and crumbling into a paste. A revolver with a limited supply of ammunition, the metal cold and heavy. A few knives, their edges dulled by use on the ship. The clothes on their backs, tearing and thinning. And the wilderness. "We are 1,000 miles from the nearest port," Musgrave stated, his voice flat and factual, refusing to sugarcoat the poison pill they had to swallow. "No one knows we are here. No one is coming for us. Not today, not next month." He saw the despair threaten to collapse Francois again, the cook's eyes rolling back in panic, so he pivoted quickly. "Which means we are the masters of our own fate. We are not waiting for rescue. We are building a life here until we can rescue ourselves." It was a lie, or at least a hope so distant it felt like a lie, but it was necessary to keep sanity intact. As the gloom outside deepened into a pitch-black night, the sounds of the island began to change. The wind never ceased, a constant mournful accompaniment, but beneath it, strange cries echoed from the shore. Guttural roars, high-pitched barks, sounds that belonged to no animal they were familiar with. It sounded like the wailing of damned souls, or the roaring of mythical beasts. "Demons," George whispered, clutching his knees, his superstition getting the better of him. "No," Renal said, peering into the dark with the pragmatic eyes of a seasoned sailor. "Life. Meat." They listened to the cacophony, realizing that they were not alone on this rock, and that their neighbors were loud, large, and likely dangerous. The isolation pressed in on them, the knowledge that beyond the circle of their firelight lay 1,000 miles of churning, freezing ocean. The morning brought no sun, only a lightening of the gray. The rain had paused, replaced by a thick, clinging mist that obscured the sea and dampened sound. The hunger was now a sharp pain, a cramping in the gut that demanded attention. The biscuits were rationed, a pathetic mouthful for each man, but dissolved instantly, leaving them wanting more, the taste of salt and flour mocking their empty stomachs. "We hunt," Musgrave announced. He took the revolver, weighing it in his hand, but Renal shook his head, placing a hand on the captain's arm. "Save the powder, Captain. We don't know what we face. We use wood, steel." It was a wise counsel. Bullets were finite, wood was not. They fashioned crude clubs and spears from the wreckage, sharpening iron bolts and lashing them to sturdy rata branches with strips of rawhide and rope. They looked less like sailors and more like Neolithic hunters as they emerged from the scrub and down to the waterline.
The tide was low, revealing a landscape of black rocks covered in slippery kelp that looked like wet leather. And there they saw them, the source of the night's roaring. Great dark shapes moving on the rocks. Seals, but not the docile creatures of storybooks. These were sea lions, massive and hulking. A bull, immense in size with a thick mane of blubber and fur, reared up as they approached, letting out a roar that vibrated in Musgrave's chest. The animal was aggressive, holding its ground, its large black eyes fixing on the intruders with intelligent malice. It lunged, moving with a terrifying speed for something so ungainly on land, propelling its bulk forward with powerful flippers. "Back!" Musgrave shouted as the jaw snapped inches from Harry's leg. The men scattered, slipping on the kelp, flailing to regain their balance. This was not a harvest. It was a war. The bull sea lion was a tank of muscle and fat, impervious to light blows, a guardian of the shore that refused to yield. "Together!" Raynal screamed, taking charge of the chaotic skirmish. "Strike the nose! Ahead!" It was a brutal, chaotic melee. The men surrounded the beast, swinging their heavy clubs with the desperation of starving men. The sound of wood hitting flesh and bone was sickening, a dull thudding that mixed with the animal's enraged bellows. The sea lion fought back, snapping its jaws, tossing its head, nearly knocking George into the surf. It took minutes that felt like hours, before the great beast finally slumped, twitching upon the rocks, its breath rattling in its throat. The men stood over it, chests heaving, adrenaline coursing through their veins, washing away the cold for a fleeting moment. They were covered in spray and sweat, their eyes wide with the realization of the violence required to survive. Musgrave looked at the dead animal. He did not see a monster. He saw salvation. He saw another day of life bought with blood. "Get the knives," he ordered, his voice trembling slightly from the exertion. "Every scrap, the meat for food, the skin for clothes, the blubber will burn." The butchery was a harrowing process. They had no expertise, only hunger. They hacked at the carcass, hands slick with blood and grease that congealed quickly in the cold air. The smell was overpowering, a mix of iron, musk, and the sea, but to their starving senses it was the perfume of life. They dragged the slabs of dark red meat and the thick sheets of blubber back to the camp, leaving a trail of red across the black rocks. The physical labor warmed them, the promise of a meal driving them forward. They were becoming part of the island's savage cycle, predators in a land of predators.
That night, the fire roared. The blubber burned with a fierce hot flame, crackling and spitting oil, sending up a thick black smoke that coated everything in soot. But the heat was magnificent. It radiated from the stone overhang, drying the air, drying their clothes. They roasted the meat on sticks. It was tough, gamey, and tasted strongly of fish and oil, but they ate it with a ravenous intensity, grease running down their beards. It was the best meal they had ever eaten. The protein settled their stomachs and cleared their heads. The warmth of the fire allowed them to uncurl their limbs for the first time in days. They sat in a circle, the firelight dancing on their soot-stained faces, looking less like victims and more like a tribe. As the men slept, exhausted by the slaughter and the fullness of their bellies, Musgrave remained awake. He sat by the blubber fire, a piece of salvaged parchment spread out on a flat rock before him. With a piece of charcoal taken from the fire's edge, he began to sketch. He drew the curve of the bay, the position of the wreck, the location of their camp. He marked the freshwater stream they had found, and the rocky point where the seals gathered. His brow was furrowed in deep concentration. He was mapping their prison. By naming the rocks, by drawing the lines, he was imposing order upon the chaos. He was turning the desolate shore into a place that could be known, and if it could be known, it could be survived. He looked up at the sleeping forms of his crew, then out into the impenetrable dark beyond the firelight. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was joined by a steely resolve. They were castaways, yes, but they were not dead yet, and as long as he drew breath, he would not let this island take them. He added a final line to his map, labeled Camp Salvation, and laid the charcoal down. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the siege they were under, but inside the cave, the fire of seal blubber burned steady and hot.
The wind over the Auckland Islands did not merely blow, it possessed a malicious, eroding quality, a constant physical weight that sought to grind the jagged rocks down to sand and the men down to madness. Having secured the most rudimentary shelter, a hovel named Epiguate that stood more as a testament to stubbornness than architecture, and a steady, albeit monotonous, diet of seal meat, the crew of the Grafton found themselves facing a new, insidious enemy: stagnation. Survival in its rawest form had been achieved, but to live, and more importantly, to escape, required more than just breathing. It required construction. It required repair. It required a return to the dominion of man over matter. Yet, as Captain Thomasa Musgrave sat on a damp log inside their smoke-filled cabin, the inventory of their capability was laughably, tragically small. He opened his hand, the skin calloused and stained with soot and seal grease, to reveal the sum total of their industrial might. It was a gimlet. A single small boring tool, scarcely larger than a man's finger, intended for making small holes in wood. It was pitted with the beginnings of rust, dulling at the tip, and entirely insufficient for the tasks that lay ahead. Around him, the crew, Reynal, the resourceful Frenchman, McLaren, Forges, and Williams, sat in a silence that was heavy with the realization of their impotence. They needed to rebuild a boat. They needed to forge fittings, straighten bolts, and craft nails. They needed an arsenal of carpentry and smithing tools, and the ocean had left them with a corkscrew's poor cousin. The silence stretched, filled only by the eternal dripping of water through the thatch and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the surf against the basalt cliffs. Musgrave closed his fingers over the gimlet, his knuckles whitening.
"We cannot stay here," Musgrave said, his voice raspy from the smoke, "and we cannot leave with this." He cast a gimlet onto the rough-hewn table. It clattered, a tiny sound against the roar of the gale outside. Reynal, whose eyes always seemed to hold a flicker of restless energy even in their darkest moments, leaned forward. "Then we make them," the Frenchman said. "We have iron. The wreck is full of it. We have wood. We have fire." "We have no forge," McLaren countered, his voice dull. "We have no hammer, no anvil, no tongs. You cannot mold iron with your bare hands, Francois." "Then we make the tools to make the tools," Musgrave interjected, the spark of an idea igniting in the dry tinder of his desperation. "It is the only way. We become blacksmiths, or we die here as savages." Thus began an endeavor of engineering so audacious it bordered on the absurd. They were 5 men on a desolate rock at the bottom of the world, attempting to recreate the Industrial Revolution from scrap. The first step was the raw material. The wreck of the Grafton, battered by the relentless surge of the Southern Ocean, was a skeletal quarry of iron bolts, copper sheathing, and twisted fittings. Retrieving them was a labor of Herculean difficulty. The water was freezing, numbing limbs in seconds. They worked in shifts, wading into the surf during low tide, battling the kelp in the undertow to pry rusted iron fasteners from the rotting ribs of their former vessel. Each bolt recovered was a victory, paid for in shivering agony and bruised flesh. They dragged the heavy iron knees and rested stanchions up the rocky beach, piling them near the hut like a dragon's hoard of worthless treasure. But iron is useless without heat, and heat, true smelting heat, requires more than a campfire. It requires a concentrated inferno. They needed charcoal. The wet, twisted rata wood that grew on the island was dense and hard, burning hot could fast. To turn it into charcoal required a controlled burn. They dug a pit in the sodden earth, lined it with stones, and filled it with the driest wood they could scavenge. Covering it with turf to restrict the oxygen, they tended the smoldering mound for days, eyes stinging from the acrid smoke, terrified that the rain would quench their effort or the wind would fan it into an uncontrollable blaze. When they finally raked out the pit, they found black, brittle lumps of carbon, fuel for the forge. The forge itself was constructed with the solemnity of an altar. They chose a spot sheltered from the direct assault of the wind, but ventilated enough to prevent asphyxiation. Using heavy basalt stones, they built a waist-high hearth, packing the gaps with clay dug from the stream bed. It was crude, ugly, and unstable, but it was a hearth. For an anvil, they scavenged a massive iron block from the ship's ballast, a rectangular hunk of metal that weighed enough to crush a man. Dragging it into position took all 5 of them, straining and cursing, their boots slipping in the mud. When it was finally seated on a stump of ironwood, Musgrave struck it with a stone. The dull clang that rang out was the first note of their new industry. However, the heart of a forge is not the fire, nor the anvil. It is the breath. Without a forced draft of air, the charcoal would never reach the temperature needed to make iron malleable. They needed bellows. This challenge seemed insurmountable. They had no leather, no valves, no pumps. But they had the seals, specifically the sea lions that hauled themselves onto the rocks, barking and fighting. They were viewed no longer just as food, but as walking raw materials. The hunt was brutal and necessary. They targeted a large bull, its skin thick and tough. After the kill, the skinning was performed with surgical care. A single slip of the knife would ruin the airtight integrity required for the bellows.
The processing of the skin was a nightmare of sensory assault. They scraped the blubber and flesh from the hide using shells and sharp stones, the stench of rancid oil permeating their clothes and pores. To cure it, they had no tannins, no chemicals. They used smoke and stretching, working the hide for hours until it was pliable. Reynal designed the mechanism. He envisioned a concertina-like device, but they lacked the materials for the frame. Instead, they settled on a bag design similar to the ancient bellows of early metallurgy. They fashioned 2 wooden paddles from the ship's planking and nailed the sealskin to the edges, sealing the seams with a mixture of grease and wood ash. The nozzle, or tuyere, presented another problem. Wood would burn. They had no iron pipe. In a stroke of genius, they salvaged a piece of copper tubing from the ship's pump mechanism, burying it deep in the clay wall of the forge to protect it from the direct heat of the fire. The intake valve was a flap of stiff leather, weighed down with a piece of lead shot, allowing air to enter when the bellows were expanded and sealing shut when compressed. It was a contraption that looked like the lung of some prehistoric beast, greasy, hairy, and grotesque. The day of the first trial was cold, the sky a bruised purple. The crew gathered around the hearth. Musgrave held the tongs, fashioned from 2 long bolts loosely riveted together. In the fire lay a thick iron bolt buried in the charcoal.
Reynal stood at the bellows. He began to pump. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The sealskin bag expanded and collapsed, the crude valve clacking. At first, the smoke billowed thick and white, choking them. Then, as the charcoal caught, the center of the pile began to glow, a dull red, then a bright cherry. Reynal pumped harder, sweat streaming down his face despite the cold. The heart of the fire turned orange, then a searing, blinding yellow. Now, Musgrave roared. He plunged the makeshift tongs into the fire and withdrew the bolt. It was glowing, radiating a heat that seared the skin of his face. He swung it onto the ballast anvil. Strike! Forges, the strongest of them, swung a heavy iron bar they were using as a hammer. Clang! Sparks, real incandescent sparks, exploded into the dim room, a firework display of human defiance. He struck again. Clang! The red-hot iron yielded, it flattened, it bent. For the first time in months, the material world was bending to their will, not the other way around. They were not merely surviving, they were altering the shape of reality. But the first attempt was far from perfect. The tongs slipped, the iron cooled too fast in the icy draft, and the hammer was awkward and unbalanced. The resulting piece of metal was a mangled lump, yet as they looked at it, cooling to a dull gray, there was no disappointment in their eyes. There was triumph. They had proven the concept. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhausting, repetitive labor, a masterclass in trial and error. They learned the nuances of the metal. They learned that heating it too long made it brittle, burning the carbon out of the iron. They learned that striking it when it was too cool caused it to crack. They learned to coordinate the rhythm of the bellows with the rhythm of the hammer. Reynal, ever the perfectionist, refined the bellows, adding a second chamber to create a continuous stream of air rather than puffs, doubling the efficiency of the heat. Their first major project was to create proper tools. Using the crude hammer, they forged a better hammer, a punch hammer with a proper handle hole. They drifted the hole through the hot iron using a pointed bolt, a process that took 3 hours of heating and striking. When they finally wedged a handle of rata wood into the head, they passed it around like a religious artifact. It was balanced, it was heavy, it was a tool.
Next came the chisels. They took high-quality steel from the ship's files, too brittle to use as levers, but perfect for cutting edges, and annealed them, softening the metal, shaping it, and then rehardening it by quenching it in seal oil. The smell of searing oil was nauseating, but the resulting hiss was the sound of progress. They tested the chisel on a piece of driftwood. It bit in clean and deep, peeling away a curl of wood. Musgrave looked at the curl of wood and felt a lump in his throat. With this, they could shape planks. With planks, they could build a boat. They moved on to augers, necessary for drilling holes for the bolts. This was precision work. Twisting the hot iron into a perfect spiral required a steady hand and an artist's eye. Many were ruined, twisted too tight or snapped in the cooling. But eventually they had a set of augers, rough but functional. They made pincers, punches, and cold chisels. They forged hundreds of nails, each one drawn out from a scrap of rusted iron, tapered and headed. The rhythmic ringing of the hammer on the anvil became the heartbeat of epic weight, a sound that competed with the wind and the sea, declaring that civilization still existed in this forgotten corner of the globe. The transformation within the men was as profound as the transformation of the iron. The lethargy of despair evaporated. They were no longer victims waiting for a rescue that might never come. They were active agents of their own destiny. The forge became the center of their social life. In the evenings, the glow of the charcoal fire provided not just heat for the metal, but light for their spirits. The chiaroscuro of the forge, the deep shadows of the hut corners, and the brilliant painting-like illumination of firelight on their faces revealed men who were physically wasting away, but spiritually hardening. Musgrave watched his crew one evening. Reynal was examining a newly forged spike, turning it over in his hands, admiring the symmetry of the head. His face, gaunt and bearded, smeared with soot, bore a look of quiet, profound pride. He wasn't looking at a piece of metal. He was looking at a ticket home. The single gimlet, the spark of their necessity, lay on a shelf, now surrounded by a growing arsenal of iron implements. It was no longer a symbol of their poverty, but a monument to their beginning. "We are doing it, Captain," Reynal said softly, catching Musgrave's eye. "We are actually doing it." "Yes, Francois," Musgrave replied, picking up the heavy hammer and feeling the weight of their collective will in his hand. "We are forging our way out of hell, one nail at a time." The wind howled outside, an impotent rage against the stone walls, but inside the fire roared back, hotter, brighter,
and infinitely more stubborn.
The wind on Auckland Island possessed a voice, a distinct and malevolent vocabulary that Thomasa Musgrave had come to learn with an intimacy that bordered on madness. It did not merely blow, it shrieked, a cacophony of tormented spirits tearing through the twisted limbs of the rata forest, carrying with it the stinging spray of the Southern Ocean and the biting chill that settled deep within the marrow of their bones. For weeks they had labored under the delusion that this wind and the starving cold were their only enemies. They believed that the battle for survival was a binary conflict, the 5 men of the Grafton against the indifferent brutality of the elements. They were wrong. The island held secrets darker than the storm clouds that perpetually strangled the peaks of the mountains, and the realization began not with a scream, but with a smudge. It was a Tuesday, or what Musgrave calculated to be a Tuesday, based on the notches carved into the central beam of their makeshift shelter, Epiguate. The morning had dawned with a deceptive calm, the gray sky hanging low and heavy, pressing the fog down upon the water until the horizon was erased. Musgrave stood on a rocky promontory, his eyes scanning the nebulous line where the sea met the sky, a ritual performed more out of disciplined habit than genuine hope. He was looking for a sail, the triangular promise of salvation. Instead, his gaze snagged on something terrestrial. Far to the north, across the jagged spine of the island's coastline, a thin wisp of gray ascended against the backdrop of darker gray clouds. It was faint, easily dismissed as a trick of the mist or the salt spray rising from the breakers. But Musgrave watched it. He held his breath, steadying his body against the damp rock. The wisp persisted. It curled with a rhythmic laziness that defied the erratic gusting of the wind. Smoke. It was smoke. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sudden violent drumbeat that seemed deafening in the silence of the morning. Fire meant men. Men meant a ship meant home. The logic fired through his synapses with the speed of a desperate prayer. But as the initial surge of euphoria crested, it shattered against a wall of cold, hard caution. If there was a ship, where was it? The bay was empty. The horizon was bare. If there were castaways, why had they not signaled? Why was the fire so small, so furtive? He turned, his boots slipping on the wet stones, and scrambled back toward the shelter. Reynal was already awake, kneeling by the hearth, blowing life into the embers of their own fire. The Frenchman looked up, seeing the wild look in his captain's eyes. "Thomas," Reynal asked, his voice rocked with sleep. "What is it? A ship?" Musgrave shook his head, struggling to regulate his breathing. "Smoke," he rasped. "To the north. Not a volcano. Wood smoke." The reaction in the small hut was immediate. Harris, Forges, and McLaren stirred from their piles of fern bedding, the word smoke acting like a galvanic shock. Hope, raw and agonizing, flooded the cramped space. But Musgrave raised a hand, silencing their rising excitement. "Listen to me," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "It is miles away. There is no ship in the harbor. If there are others, we do not know who they are. We do not know their condition." Reynal, ever the pragmatist, nodded slowly, the light in his eyes dimming to a sharp, analytical focus. "If they are survivors," Reynal said, "they may be in worse straits than us. Or," he left a sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy in the damp hail. "Shipwrecks did strange things to men. They stripped away the veneer of civilization, leaving behind only the primal animal." "We scout," Musgrave decided. "Reynal and I. The rest of you stay here. Guard the supplies. Keep the fire low. If we are not back by nightfall." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The preparations were made in a grim silence. They took their sturdiest walking sticks weighted with lead salvage from the wreck, makeshift clouds they could crack a seal skull or a man's. They packed dried seal meat in a flask of precious water. As they stepped out into the mist, the shelter of Epiguate felt less like a home and more like a fortress they were leaving vulnerable. The track north was a nightmare of topography. The Auckland Island scrub was not merely vegetation, it was a physical barrier, a tangled web of gnarled roots branches that seemed designed to break ankles and crush spirits. They moved silently, communicating with hand signals, the fog fogging them all. Hours bled into one another. The terrain rose and fell in punishing undulations. As they drew closer to the estimated location of the smoke, the smell hit them. It was faint at first, carried on a shifting breeze, but it was unmistakable. It was not the clean, woodsy scent of your own hearth. It was something acrid, greasy, sweet. Musgrave stopped, gripping Reynal's arm. The Frenchman's face was pale, his nostrils flaring. "Do you smell that?" Musgrave whispered, thorns tasting like ash in his mouth. "Cooking," Reynal replied, but there was no hunger in his voice, only a dawning horror. "But meat, burnt meat." They crept forward, dropping to their bellies as they crested a ridge overlooking a small rocky inlet. The fog thinned momentarily, granting them a window into hell. Below them, on a miserable strip of shingle beach, was a camp, but it was a mockery of a camp. There was no shelter, only piles of driftwood and rotting chalk. In the center, a fire burned fitfully. Huddled around them are figures, 4 of them, or were they 5? It was hard to tell where the rags ended and the emaciated flesh began. They were skeletal, their hair matted into thick robes of filth, their skin covered in sores. They moved with a jerky, frantic energy, quarreling over something in the fire. Musgrave squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. One of the figures raised an object to his mouth. It was a bone, a long bone, too long for a seal, too thick for a bird. Musgrave felt the bile rise in his throat, a scalding tie to revulsion. He looked at Reynal. The Frenchman had his hand covered over his mouth, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended the fear of death. He pointed a troubling finger at the edge of the firelight.
blow. These were not merely other survivors. These were the damned, the crew of the Invercalled. The Musgrave did God know the ship's name then, and descended into the ultimate abyss. They had broken the final taboo. They were eating their dead, or perhaps, Musgrave thought with a shudder that rattled his teeth, they were not waiting for them to die. A snap of a twig, loud as a gunshot in the dead silence, froze them. Down on the beach, one of the creatures, for they could hardly be called men anymore, snapped his head up, his eyes sunken into black pits, scanned the ridge. He sniffed the air, animal-like. Musgrave pressed his face into the wet moss, praying to a god he felt had long event to this latitude. He held his breath until his lungs burned. After an eternity, the figure returned to his grisly meal. "We go," breathed into Rainall's air. Now, quietly. The retreat was a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. Every shadow looked like a crouching cannibal. Every rustle of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. They did not stop until they were miles away, and even then they kept looking back.
When they finally stumbled back into Epigwait, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the camp. Harris, Forges, and McLaren were waiting, their faces eager for news. The look on Musgrave's face stopped them dead. He walked to the fire and sat down heavily, the club falling from his numb fingers. "Captain," Harris asked softly, "are there others?" "Yes," Musgrave said, his voice hollow. "There are others." He looked up, and his crew saw a darkness in his eyes that had not been there that morning. "But we are alone," he told them. He told them everything. He spared no detail of the squalor, the madness, the bones. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the hut shifted. The camaraderie, the gentle hope, the shared suffering, it all hardened into something brittle and sharp. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "They are starving," Raynall added quietly, staring into the flames. "Starving men do desperate things. But these, they have lost their minds. They are wolves." "Will they come here?" Forges asked, his voice trembling. He was the youngest, the most vulnerable to the night terrors. "If they find us," Musgrave said grimly, "if they smell our food, if they see our smoke." He stood up, the exhaustion replaced by a manic resolve. "We are not wolves. We are men, and we will defend this place, from the storm and from them." The transformation of Epigwait began that night. It ceased to be a shelter and became a bastion. The psychological toll was immediate and immense. Before, the wilderness was a passive enemy. Now it was an active threat. The darkness was no longer empty. It was inhabited. They reinforced the walls with heavier timber, dragging logs from the forest with a strength born of fear. They sharpened stakes, turning their walking sticks into spears. They established a watch. No longer would they sleep soundly, trusting in their isolation. Now, one man would always be awake, eyes peeling back the darkness, listening. The first watch fell to Harris. He sat by the door, a crude spear across his lap, peering out through a small chink they had left in the fortification. The fog had returned, thicker than before, a white wall that pressed against the hut. Harris stared into it until his eyes watered, his mind conjuring shapes from the swirling vapor. Was that a face? A hand reaching out? He gripped the spear until his knuckles turned white. He thought of his family back home, of the warm hearths and civilized streets, and contrasted it with the monstrosity just a few miles north. The knowledge that humans could fall so low, could become so bestial, shook the foundations of his worldview. It wasn't just the fear of being eaten, it was the fear of becoming them. The contagion of madness seemed to hang in the air like the mist. Inside the hut, the others slept fitfully. Musgrave lay awake, staring at the thatched roof. He knew that the greatest danger now was not the cannibals, but the paranoia itself. If they let fear rule them, they would turn on each other. He had to keep them busy. He had to keep them civilized. "We will build a forge," he whispered to himself. "We will tan skins. We will teach each other mathematics. We will read the Bible." He listed these things like a litany against the dark. The days turned into a blur of frantic activity and vigilant dread. They limited their fires to the daylight hours to hide the smoke. They buried their refuse deep to hide the smell. They moved through the forest like ghosts, avoiding open ground. The contrast between their camp and the one Musgrave had seen was stark. At Epigwait, they washed their clothes. They said grace before their meager meals of seal meat. They held democratic councils. They clung to these rituals not just for order, but for sanity. They were defining themselves in opposition to the others. We are the civilized. They are the savages. It was a necessary dichotomy, a psychological wall as important as a physical one they had built. One afternoon, a week after the discovery, Raynall was gathering firewood near the edge of their perimeter. The forest was silent, save for the dripping of water from the canopy. Then he heard it. A crack. Not the wind. The footstep. He froze, melting his body against the trunk of a massive rata tree. His heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped his axe, his knuckles white. Through the undergrowth, about 50 yards away, a figure moved. It was one of them. The man was moving slowly, dragging a club behind him. He was muttering to himself, a low, unintelligible stream of gibberish.
Reynald held his breath, praying the wind would not shift. The savage paused, lifting his head. He looked directly at the tree where Reynald hid. His eyes were wild, red-rimmed, searching. Reynald saw the face clearly, a mask of soot and blood, the lips pulled back in a permanent wrinkness in desperation. For a moment, time suspended. Reynald calculated the distance. If the man charged, Reynald would have to kill him. The thought brought a wave of nausea, but also a cold, hard resolve. He would not let that thing near Musgrave's. He would not let it near the hut. The savage sniffed the air again, then, seemingly losing interest or distracted by some internal hallucination, turned and shambled away into the mist. Reynald waited 10 minutes, 20, before exhaling. He returned to the camp, his legs shaking. He told Musgrave. "They are ranging further," Musgrave said, his face setting into a mask of stone, searching for food. "We need to be ready," Reynald said. "If they come in force, we fight," Musgrave said. "We have the high ground. We have discipline. They are weak, chaotic." But the bravado masked deep, gnawing fear. That night the wind howled louder than ever, and every creak of the hut's timber sounded like the prying fingers of the dead. The crew of the Grafton sat around their darkness hearth, the embers casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. They looked at each other, seeing the cotton lines of their own hunger, the wildness in their own beards. How far were they really from the men on the beach? A few weeks of starvation, a tragedy. The line between man and beast was thinner than they had ever imagined, and on Auckland Island, the mist was always trying to erase it. They slept in shifts, hands on their weapons, dreaming of teeth and bones, while the shadows in the mist watched and waited.
Ciemność na wyspach Auckland nie była jedynie brakiem światła, była fizycznym ciężarem, wilgotnym całunem, który przywierał do skóry i przenikał do szpiku kości. Dla kapitana Thomasa Musgrave'a i jego 4 towarzyszy poranek nie przynosił ulgi, lecz jedynie zmianę odcienia szarości. Jednak tego dnia, w 5. miesiącu ich przymusowego wygnania, szarość ta miała w sobie nową jakość. Nie była już kolorem beznadziei, lecz tłem dla najambitniejszego przedsięwzięcia ich życia. Decyzja zapadła. Oczekiwanie na ratunek było powolną śmiercią. Musieli wziąć los w swoje ręce, dłonie zniszczone solą i pracą, i wyrwać wolność z trzewi tej przeklętej wyspy. Projekt budowy nowej łodzi, czy też radykalnej przebudowy szalupy, stał się ich nową religią. Poprzednie tygodnie spędzili na walce z ogniem i żelazem, tworząc narzędzia w prymitywnej kuźni Reynala. Teraz, gdy w ich arsenale znajdowały się topory, dłuta, świdry i, co najważniejsze, zęby piły wykute z obręczy starej beczki, nadszedł czas, by zwrócić się przeciwko samej naturze wyspy, przeciwko ich lasom. Las Rata, porastający zbocza wokół Carnley Harbour, nie przypominał lasów, jakie znali z Europy czy Ameryki. Drzewa te, Metrosideros umbandata, zwane południowym drzewem żelaznym, były potworami skręconymi przez wieczne wichury. Ich pnie nie rosły prosto ku niebu, wiły się, skręcały i płożyły, jakby same drzewa czołgały się w bólu. Drewno było twarde jak kamień, gęste i nieustępliwe. To był ich budulec, to był ich wróg i ich zbawienie. Pierwszym etapem było znalezienie odpowiedniego drzewa na stępkę, kręgosłup ich przyszłej arki. Musgrave z Reynalem u boku brodził w błocie sięgającym kostek, badając każdy pień. Deszcz, ich wierny i niechciany towarzysz, zacinał poziomo, smagając twarze lodowatymi piczami. To tutaj, wskazał Reynal, kładąc dłoń na omszałym pniu, który wydawał się wystarczająco prosty na odcinku kilku metrów, by posłużyć za podstawę. Jeśli uda nam się to ściąć, kapitanie, mamy początek. Ścięcie drzewa żelaznego przy użyciu ręcznie kutych, często tępiących się siekier, była katorgą. Każde uderzenie odrzucało wibracje w ramiona, jakby uderzali w lity metal. Harris i Forges, ludzie nawykli do ciężkiej pracy na morzu, klęli cicho pod nosem, zamieniając się miejscami, gdy mięśnie odmawiali posłuszeństwa. Oddech parował w zimnym powietrzu, mieszając się z potem, który stygł natychmiast na ich czołach. Dźwięk uderzeń niósł się głucho po zatoce, jedyny znak ludzkiej aktywności na tysiące mil oceanicznej pustki. Gdy drzewo wreszcie upadło z trzaskiem łamanych gałęzi, nie było wiwatów, było tylko ciężkie dyszenie i świadomość, że to dopiero początek. Musieli je ociosać, przetransportować i, co najtrudniejsze, przepiłować wzrusz. Stworzenie dołu do piłowania tarcicy było kolejnym heroicznym wyczynem inżynierii desperacji. Wykopali dół w podmokłym gruncie, walcząc z napływającą wodą, którą musieli nieustannie wybierać. Jeden człowiek stał na górze, na kłodzie, drugi w dole, w błocie i trocinach sypiących się prosto w oczy. Piła, którą stworzyli, była cudem prymitywnej metalurgii, ale daleko jej było do fabrycznej precyzji. Zęby często się blokowały, a blacha wyginała. Reynal z nieskończoną cierpliwością prostował ją i ostrzył, wiedząc, że bez desek nie będzie łodzi, a bez łodzi nie będzie życia.
Każda deska, którą udało im się uzyskać, była okupiona godzinami morderczego wysiłku. Często okazywało się, że pień jest spróchniały w środku lub pęknięty i praca całego dnia szła na marne. W takich chwilach morale wisiało na włosku. Widziałem wtedy w oczach McLarena pustkę, tę samą, która zwiastuje szaleństwo. Ale wtedy Musgrave ze swoim stoickim spokojem kładł rękę na ramieniu marynarza. Jutro znajdziemy lepsze drzewo, mówił, na jego głos nie dopuszczał sprzeciwu. To nie był optymizm, to był rozkaz przetrwania. Konstrukcja kadłuba wymagała czegoś więcej niż siły, wymagała sztuki szkutniczej, której żaden z nich w pełni nie posiadał. Byli wielorybnikami, łowcami fok, marynarzami, ale nie szkutnikami. Uczyli się na błędach, improwizowali. Reynal stał się mózgiem operacji. Jego francuski umysł inżyniera widział rozwiązania tam, gdzie inni widzieli przeszkody. Kiedy nie mieli jak wyciąć desek na poszycie, wymyślił parownik z kociołka po wokach. Kiedy brakowało im naturalnie krzywie konarów na wręgi, Reynal opracował sposób łączenia mniejszych kawałków drewna w solidne żebra przy użyciu skomplikowanych złączy, które następnie wzmacniali nitami. A nity to była osobna saga. Każdy gwóźdź, każdy nit, każda śruba musiała zostać wykuta ręcznie ze złomu odzyskanego z wraku Graftona. Przez i Reynal spędzali noce przy miechu w dłowiącym dymie węgla drzewnego, który sami wypalali. Stukot młota o kowadło stał się biciem serca obozu. Była to muzyka nadziei. Każdy wyprodutkami gwóźdź był małym zwycięstwem nad nicością. Musgrave z obsesyjną dokładnością sprawdzał każdy element. Wiedział, że na pełnym oceanie, gdzie fale mogą osiągnąć wysokość masztu, najmniejsza słabość konstrukcji oznacza śmierć. Przesuwał dłonią po szorskim drewnie stępki, wyczuwając nierówności, szukając rynków. Czuł pod palcami historię ich cierpienia i determinacji.
Ta łódź nie była martwym przedmiotem. Rodziła się z ich potu, krwi i strachu. Była ich wspólnym ciałem, nową powłoką, w której mieli nadzieję narodzić się na nowo dla świata. Tygodnie zamieniały się w miesiące. Zima na półkuli południowej zaciskała pętle. Dni były krótkie, a wiatry tak silne, że musieli przerywać pracę, by chronić niedokończony kadłub, przykrywając go resztkami żagli i własnymi ciałami. Jednej nocy sztorm uderzył z taką furią, że drzewa wokół obozu łamały się jak zapałki. Wicher wył jak potępiona dusza, grożąc, że porwie ich wątłą konstrukcję i ciśnie ją w morze. Wszyscy wybiegli w noc, w strugi ulewnego deszczu, by trzymać liny, by osłaniać swoje dzieło. Stali tak godzinami, przemoczeni, drżący z zimna, zapierając się nogami w błocie, tworząc żywą tarczę wokół szkieletu łodzi. W błyskach piorunów ich twarze wyglądały jak maski demonów, wykrzywione wysiłkiem i determinacją. W tej chwili nie byli już oddzielnymi jednostkami, byli jednością, organizmem walczącym o przetrwanie. Gdy świt przyniósł uspokojenie, a łódź wciąż stała na swoim miejscu nienaruszona, wiedzieli, że wygrali coś więcej niż tylko walkę z wiatrem. Wygrali wiarę w to, że mogą dokonać niemożliwego. Poszycie kadłuba postępowało powoli. Każda deska musiała być dopasowana indywidualnie. Nie mieli luksusu standardowych wymiarów. Używali sznurka nasączonego tłuszczem fok i sadzą jako uszczelnienia między deskami, ich wersja paku. Zapach tego szczeliwa był ostry i mdły, ale dla nich pachniał jak dom. Był to zapach szczelności, bezpieczeństwa. Kiedy kadłub wreszcie został zamknięty, wyglądał dziwacznie. Był pękaty, solidny, pozbawiony elegancji jachtów, ale emanował brutalną siłą. Był to bękart inżynierii i konieczności, brzydki i piękny zarazem. Pozostała kwestia ożaglowania. Stare żagle z Graftona były zbutwiałe, pełne dziur. Harris, który najlepiej znał się na szyciu, spędzał całe dnie z igłą zrobioną z kości albatrosa, łatając płótno, wzmacniając szwy, tworząc z resztek coś, co mogła złapać wiatr. Wykorzystali każdą szmatę, każdy kawałek materiału. Maszty zrobili z młodych, w miarę prostych drzew rata, wygładzając je z mozołem. I wreszcie nadszedł dzień, gdy statek, bo tak o nim myśleli, mimo że był niewiele większy od szalupy, stanął gotowy. Brakowało mu jeszcze tylko jednego – imienia. Zebrali się wieczorem wokół ogniska, wpatrując się w ciemny zarys kadłuba majaczący na tle drzew. Dyskusja była cicha, pełna powagi. Padły propozycje – ucieczka, zemsta, wolność. Ale żadne z tych słów nie oddawało w pełni tego, czym ta łódź była. Reynal zasugerował l'espérance, nadzieja. Musgrave pokiwał głową, ale jego myśli krążyły wokół samej istoty ich czynu. Przetrwali głód, zimno, choroby i rozpacz. Zbudowali coś z niczego. Nazwijmy ją rescue, ratunek, powiedział w końcu Musgrave. Choć w jego dzienniku i sercu łódź ta na zawsze pozostała symbolem czystego przetrwania, survival. Ale oficjalnie, dla świata, do którego chcieli wrócić, miała być rescue. To była deklaracja. Nie czekali na ratunek, sami nim byli. Nazwa została wyryta na rufie. Nieudolnie, ale głęboko. Patrząc na ten napis, czuli, jak zmienia się ich tożsamość. Przestali być rozbitkami, ofiarami losu. Stali się budownikami własnego przeznaczenia. Łódź, choć stała jeszcze na lądzie, już w ich umysłach pruła fale, niosąc ich ku Nowej Zelandii. Była to krucha łupina, która miała zmierzyć się z najgorszym oceanem świata, ale w tamtej chwili wydawała im się potężniejsza niż jakikolwiek pancernik. Była naczyniem ich nadziei, fizyczną manifestacją ich woli życia. Gdy kładli się spać tej nocy, sen przyszedł łatwiej. Szum deszczu o dach chaty nie był już zwiastunem gnicia, lecz przypomnieniem o morzu, które wkrótce mieli pokonać.
Sisa, która zapadła nad Epworth ostatniej nocy, była cięższa niż ołów. Przez 20 miesięcy ten prymitywny szałas, zbudowany z wraków i desperacji, był ich fortecą przeciwko bezlitosnym wiatrom wysp Auckland. Teraz w migotliwym świetle ostatniej lampy na olej z foki ściany wydawały się oddychać wspomnieniami bólu, głodu, ale i niezwykłego braterstwa. Thomas Musgrave siedział w milczeniu, przesuwając kciukiem po krawędzi swojego dziennika. Decyzja została podjęta. Nie było odwrotu. Jutro rano powierzą swoje życie ratunkowi, The Rescue, łupinie orzecha, którą François Reynal przekształcił z rozbitego bączka w coś, co miało przypominać pełnomorski statek. Powietrze pachniało wilgotną ziemią, dymem i stęchlizną schnących skór, zapachem, który stał się ich drugą skórą. Każdy z mężczyzn leżał na swojej pryczy, ale nikt nie spał. Słuchali wiatru. Zawsze słuchali wiatru. Tej nocy wycie na zewnątrz brzmiało inaczej, nie jak groźba, lecz jak wyzwanie. Musgrave spojrzał na Reynala. Francuz, mimo fizycznego wycieńczenia i chronicznego bólu, miał w oczach błysk inżyniera, który patrzy na swoje dzieło z mieszaniną dumy i przerażenia. Wiedzieli, że statystyka jest przeciwko nim. Wiedzieli, że ocean południowy, ten cmentarz statków, nie wybacza błędów. A jednak alternatywą była powolna śmierć z głodu i zapomnienia w tym zapomnianym przez Boga zakątku świata. Świt nadszedł szary i zimny, niosąc ze sobą rzadkę, która wsiąkała w kości. Wyprowadzenie łodzi na zewnątrz było pierwszym testem. Ich ciała, osłabione miesiącami niedożywienia, protestowały przy każdym pchnięciu. Ratunek wydawał się absurdalnie mały w konfrontacji z surowym krajobrazem zatoki. Kiedy zepchnęli go na przybój, zimna woda uderzyła w nich jak fizyczny cios, zapierając dech w piersiach. Fale w zatoce były chaotyczne. Spienione grzywacze uderzały o burtę, grożąc wywróceniem łodzi jeszcze zanim misja się na dobre rozpoczęła. Musgrave krzyczał rozkazy. Jego głos ledwo przebijał się przez huk wody. Równo! Trzymać go prosto na falę! Wrzeszczał, zapierając się nogami w śliskim dnie. Reynal, mimo że ledwo stał na nogach, pracował z furią, zabezpieczając balast. Każdy ruch był walką z żywiołem. Kiedy w końcu wdrapali się na pokład i odbili od brzegu, moment ten nie był triumfem, lecz chwilą czystego, skrystalizowanego terroru. Zostawiali za sobą jedyne bezpieczeństwo, jakie znali, na rzecz otchłani. Gdy żagiel złapał wiatr, a ląd zaczął się oddalać, Musgrave poczuł ucisk w żołądku. Patrzył na znikający zarys ich szałasu, na dym dogasającego ogniska, który szybko rozwiewał wiatr. To był ich dom, to było ich więzienie. Teraz byli wolni, ale ta wolność miała smak soli i żółci. Wyjście na otwarty ocean było jak wejście do pralki pełnej lodowatych kamieni. Gdy tylko minęli osłonę cypla, uderzyła w nich pełna furia ryczących 40. Fale, które w zatoce wydawały się duże, tutaj zamieniły się w płynne góry. Horyzont przestał istnieć. Świat skurczył się do nieustannie zmieniających się ścian wody, które wznosiły się nad nimi, zasłaniając niebo, by po chwili zapaść się w głębokie doliny, w które ratunek spadał z żołądkiem w gardle. Łódź trzeszczała. Każda deska, każdy gwóźdź wykuty ręcznie przez Reynala jęczał pod naporem ciśnienia. Woda wdzierała się do środka z każdą falą. Wylewać! Nie przestawajcie wylewać! Komenda ta stała się ich mantrą. Nie było zmian, nie było odpoczynku. Musgrave siedział przy sterze. Jego dłonie zaciśnięte na rumpel tak mocno, że knokcie zbialały.
Jego twarz była maską skupienia, choć wnętrzem walczył z paraliżującym strachem. Musiał czytać fale, przewidywać ich ruch, ustawiać łódź tak, by nie została uderzona burtą, co oznaczałoby natychmiastową śmierć. Mijały godziny, które zlewały się w jedną niekończącą się udrękę. Zimno było nie do opisania. Ich ubrania, zrobione ze skór fok, nasiąkły wodą i stały się ciężkie jak zbroje, nie dając już żadnego ciepła. Wiatr wiejący z siłą huraganu ścinał wierzchołki fal, zamieniając powietrze w mieszaninę soli i piany, która cięła twarz jak drobne szkło. Reynal kulił się na dnie łodzi, próbując chronić prymitywny kompas, ich jedyne ogniwo z nadzieją na nawigację.
Noc przyniosła ze sobą nowy wymiar horroru. W ciemnościach nie widzieli fal, mogli je tylko słyszeć, narastający huk, jak pociąg towarowy zbliżający się w tunelu, a potem uderzenie i uczucie spadania w nicość. Musgrave sterował instynktownie, wyczuwając ruch wody pod kadłubem. Fosforescencja planktonu sprawiała, że grzbiety fal świeciły upiornym, zielonkawym blaskiem, oświetlając przerażone twarze załogi. Każdy z nich modlił się na swój sposób lub po prostu trwał w otępieniu, mechanicznym ruchem wybierając wodę wiadrem. W pewnym momencie gigantyczna fala, większa niż inne, załamała się tuż nad nimi. Tona wody runęła na małą łódź. Ratunek przechylił się gwałtownie, prawie kładąc masztem na wodzie. Krzyk uwierzył im w gardłach. Przez ułamek sekundy wydawało się, że to koniec, że ocean wreszcie upomniał się o swoją ofiarę. Ale łódź, dzięki geniuszowi konstrukcyjnemu Reynala i odpowiedniemu balastowi, z jękiem podniosła się. Byli po kolana w wodzie. Z furią godną szaleńców rzucili się do czerpaków, wylewali wodę, walcząc o każdy centymetr wyporności, dysząc ciężko, z sercami walącymi jak młoty. Trzeciego dnia halucynacje zaczęły mieszać się z rzeczywistością. Zmęczenie, odwodnienie i hipotermia zbierały swoje żniwo. Jeden z marynarzy widział ląd tam, gdzie były tylko chmury. Inny słyszał dzwony kościelne w wyciu wiatru. Musgrave musiał zachować trzeźwość umysłu za nich wszystkich. Wiedział, że jeśli straci kurs choć na godzinę, mogą ominąć wyspę Stewart i zginąć na bezmierze Pacyfiku. Jego oczy, przekrwione od soli i braku snu, wpatrywały się w szałą mgłę przed dziobem. Jego przywództwo było w tym momencie czymś więcej niż tylko nawigacją. Było aktem woli, który trzymał ich dusze przy ciałach. Mówił do nich, czasem krzyczał, zmuszając do ruchu, nie pozwalając im zastygnąć w śmiertelnym letargu. Wtedy to się stało. Piątego dnia, gdy nadzieja była już tylko nikłym płomienem, wiatr nieco zelżał, a zasłona deszczu na chwilę się podniosła. Musgrave mrugnął coś niewyraźnie, przecierając oczy. Na horyzoncie, szarym na tle szarego nieba, majaczył ciemniejszy kształt. Nie była to chmura. Kształt był stały, kędziasty. Ziemia! Słowo to wyrwało się z jego gardła jak szloch. Elektryczny impuls przeszedł przez załogę. Wyprostowali się, zapominając o bólu, o zimnie, o głodzie. Wpatrywali się w ten punkt jak w objawienie. To była wyspa Stewart, cywilizacja, życie. Ostatnie godziny rejsu były warką z prądem i resztkami sił, ale w ich żyłach płynęła teraz nowa energia, adrenalina ocalenia. Gdy ratunek w końcu skrzydnął kilem o świr w Port Adventure, nie było wiwatów, byli zbyt wyczerpani. Wypadli z łodzi do płytkiej wody, czołgając się na czworakach po plaży, całując mokry piasek, płacząc bezgłośnie. Ocean, który próbował ich zabić, został za nimi. Dokonali niemożliwego. Przekroczyli piekło w trywialnej trumnie i wyszli z niego żywi.
The horizon was a jagged scar where the gray ocean met the gray sky, a seamless curtain of indifference that had imprisoned them for 20 months. Thomasa Musgrave stood at the tiller of the Rescue, the makeshift vessel that defied every principle of naval architecture, yet held the weight of their salvation. It was not a ship, it was a prayer, constructed of driftwood and scrap metal, caulked with seal blood and hope. Beside him, Francois Reynal, his body wasted by scurvy, but his spirit burning with a feverish intensity, watched the swells. They were 5 days out from the Auckland Islands, 5 days into a desperate gamble across the Southern Ocean towards Stewart Island. The wind bit through their sealskin garments, a cold that settled in the marrow. But for the first time in nearly 2 years, the wind carried something other than the scent of ice and rotting kelp. It carried the smell of wood smoke, real smoke. Not the acrid burning of blubber that had stained their lungs, but the sweet, resinous scent of burning timber, the scent of man. Musgrave narrowed his eyes, the salt crust cracking on his cheeks. "Do you smell it, Francois?" he rasped, his voice a broken instrument unused to volume. Reynal nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "Civilization," the Frenchman whispered, the word feeling alien on his tongue. "We have beaten the devil at his own door." The sighting of the coast of Stewart Island was not a cinematic crescendo of fanfare, but a slow, agonizing revelation through the lifting fog. Green trees. Not the stunted, twisted rata forest of the Aucklands, but tall, majestic timber. The sight broke something inside Musgrave, the dam of stoicism he had built to lead his men, to keep them from the abyss of madness. He felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with the cold. They steered the rescue into the shelter of Port Adventure, the silence of the bay amplifying the pounding of their own hearts. When the cutter Flying Scud came into view, anchored peacefully, its lines clean and manufactured, it looked like a spacecraft from another world. The interaction that followed was a blur of disjointed sensory overload. Captain Cross of the Flying Scud looked down from his rail at the two apparitions drifting alongside him. Musgrave and Raynal were specters, clothed in patchwork skins, their hair matted manes, their eyes burning with the 1,000-yard stare of men who have seen the edge of the world. "Who are you?" Cross called out, his voice tinged with disbelief. Musgrave tried to stand tall to summon the dignity of a captain, but his legs were jelly. "I am Thomas Musgrave," he croaked, holding up a hand that looked more like a claw. "Late of the schooner Grafton. Wrecked 20 months ago." The silence that stretched across the water was absolute. The sailors on the Flying Scud froze. The Grafton had been given up for lost, a ghost story of the southern seas. To see its captain rise from the ocean in a boat stitched together with flax and desperation was to witness a resurrection. The relief that washed over Musgrave was physical, a crushing weight lifting from his chest that nearly sent him to his knees. They were hauled aboard, not as castaways, but as miracles. The sensation of dry wool blankets, the taste of hot tea heavily sweetened with sugar, the softness of a mattress, these simple comforts induced a state of shock. Raynal wept openly into a loaf of bread, the texture of the crust overwhelming its senses. But the mission was not over. 3 men remained in the living hell of Carly Happer. Harris, Forges, and McLaren were waiting, their eyes scanning the empty horizon, their hope dwindling with every sunset. Musgrave, despite his exhaustion, despite the ravages of his body, refused to rest. "We go back," he told Captain Cross, his voice gaining strength. "I will not sleep in a bed while my men sleep on the ground." The return journey on the Flying Scud was a surreal inversion of their escape. Riding a sturdy ship, powered by canvas that wasn't rotting, guided by charts and compasses, Musgrave felt a disconnect from reality. As the Auckland Islands came back into view, the sheer malevolence of the place struck him anew. The towering cliffs of Cannibal Rock, the grey churning surf, the Relin-Musgrain, it was a landscape designed to kill. Yet, they had lived. The rescue of the remaining 3 was a scene of raw, unfiltered humanity. When the Flying Scud entered the harbour, the smoke signal went up from the shore, a desperate light column against the sky.
Musgrave went ashore in the longboat. The reunion was devoid of words. What language exists to bridge the gap between certain death and sudden life? They embraced, weeping, collapsing into a heap of sealskin and emaciated limbs. It was a testament to the bond they had forged, a brotherhood of survival that transcended rank or nationality. They had not turned on each other. They had not succumbed to the darkness. As they sailed away from the Auckland Islands for the final time, Musgrave stood at the stern, watching the jagged silhouette fade into the mist. He held in his hand a crude needle he had fashioned from the wing bone of an albatross. It was a small thing, ugly and rough, but it represented everything. With this they had sewn their clothes. With tools like this they had built a cabin. With a forge made of stone they had fixed the boat. They had created a society where there was none. The return to civilization, first to Invercargill, then to Melbourne, was a collision with a world that had moved on, yet was captivated by their return. The press dubbed it a miracle. Musgrave and his crew were paraded before incredulous audiences, living exhibits of human endurance. In a crowded hall in Melbourne, Musgrave stood before a hushed crowd, the gaslights casting long shadows across the stage. He laid out their artifacts, the bone needles, the sealskin boots, the journal written in seal blood when the ink ran dry. "You ask how we survived," Musgrave addressed the room, his voice steady now, carrying the gravity of the gale. "We survived because we did not forget we were men. We worked, we built, we taught each other. We established a school in the wilderness. We read the Bible, we kept the hours." He paused, looking at the soft, clean faces in the audience, faces that had never known the bite of a 60-knot wind or the gnawing pain of a belly empty for 3 days. The wilderness wanted to strip us to the animal. We refused. The triumph of the Grafton crew, however, was soon shadowed by a darker revelation. Around the same time, news broke of the Invercargill, another ship wrecked on the very same Auckland Islands on the northern coast during the same period. The contrast was a chilling study in human nature. The Invercargill had 19 survivors initially. They had no Musgrave. They had no Raynal. They fractured. They fought. They succumbed to the basest instincts of survival. Of the 19, only 3 survived to be rescued, and they had resorted to horrors that polite society refused to print in detail.
cannibalism, abandonment, the strong preying on the weak. The Grafton Five had lived as a democracy of effort. The Invercold group had died as a tyranny of despair. This realization haunted Musgrave. It wasn't the geography that killed, it was the breakdown of the social contract. The Grafton was the anti-Lord of the Flies. Where Golding's fiction posited that civilization is a thin veneer over savagery, Musgrave's reality proved that cooperation and compassion are the true bedrock of survival. The legacy of their ordeal settled into the quiet moments of their later lives. Musgrave published his journals, a text of grit and ingenuity, but the fame faded, as all news does. Yet the scars, both physical and mental, remained. In the quiet of the night, the sound of the wind would transport them back to the hut, to the smell of curing skins and the eternal waiting. But there was no regret, only a profound, melancholy gratitude. The final image of the saga is not one of grand celebration, but of quiet reflection. Imagine Musgrave, years later, an old man, sitting by a warm hearth. He holds the albatross bone needle in his hand, turning it over and over. The firelight catches the scratches on the bone. He closes his eyes and sees the faces of his crew, Raynal, Harris, Forges, McLaren. He hears the roar of the Southern Ocean. He realizes that they did not just save their lives, they saved their humanity. They proved that even in the darkest corner of the earth, stripped of everything that defines civilization, men can choose to be brothers rather than beasts. The Auckland Islands remain, a desolate kingdom of wind and seal, but the story of the Grafton overlays it like a map of the human spirit, a forgotten tale of courage that stands as a beacon against the darkness of the wild. The world was reclaimed not by conquering nature, but by mastering themselves.